that's going on? There we go. Here it is. All right. Hello and welcome to the EU-India People Summit. You're with me, Dr. Ritumbra Manuvie, and this is our 6th day of the summit, where we are now going to enter into some of the very crucial relationships building up in the coming future in transnational relations as well as national relations. And this is the relation which rests on the fourth pillar of democracy, which is the media. So we are in this session going to tackle disinformation and media landscape, the hate speech and disinformation landscape. And with me, I have 3 of the very prominent people who do not really need any mention, but to introduce you all still to them, I have with me N. Ram. N. Ram is a very well-known journalist from India. He's the chairman of Kasturi and Sons Limited and publisher of one of the most circulated English language newspaper in India, The Hindu. As an investigative journalist at heart, Ram exposed the Bofors scandal, a major weapons contract between India and Sweden, and received the Asian Investigative Journalist of the Year award for it in 1990. In his own way, Ram has defined the standards of journalism in India, and a lot of us within the organizing committee, as well as in our audience, grew up reading The Hindu with our breakfast in the morning. Then joining me is Alaphia. She is the advocacy director at reset.tech and is in charge of developing advocacy and campaigning strategies, including partner engagements. Alaphia has been instrumental in building a diverse and global network of civil society groups and stakeholders working to tackle digital threats to democracy. You have also worked as a campaigner at the Amnesty International and at Awaz, and you have focused on issues of media reforms, human rights, and the impact of digital hate speech on minorities. One of your successes includes protecting Sky Television in the UK from a takeover by media mogul Rupert Murdoch. Finally, I have with me Pratik Sinha. Once again, doesn't need any mention. He is the co-founder of AltNews and has been a champion of fighting fake news in India since 2017. He is perhaps one of the most well-known fake news debunker in India. So I would like to welcome you all to this panel. And as I said to you earlier, that this is going to be a conversational style panel where we will be talking about the media landscape and the age of disinformation. So my first question is to you, Mr. Ram, on how do you see this landscape of media changing, because you have been there for a very long period of time through your illustrious career, and you have seen the changes from the print going to the web media, and you have also perhaps led some of these changes. So Mr. Ram, please.
Yeah, thank you. Before I try to respond to your question, let me say that I'm no longer chairman of the group. I'm a director, whole-time director, because I'm getting on, but I'm quite active. So that, just to clear that one. Yes, there's been a profound change. Everyone knows that. I started when printed newspapers were important. We spent a great deal of time on editorials and writing opinions, although we knew only probably about, maybe if lucky, 10% of your readers would read your editorials, but we spent a great deal of time. I personally spent a great deal of time once I'd gone through my apprenticeship and reporting, editing, etc. Once we got into editorial writing in the 70s or mid-70s, a little towards the end of the 70s, we devoted a great deal of time, and we thought we were taken notice of by policymakers, by not everyone, but informed sections of the public, and so on. So we thought we were very relevant. And later on, I sort of conceptualized the role that I understood the news media and journalism to be playing. Of course, you must make a distinction between the news media and journalism, because when you talk about the fortunes of the news media, you're talking about the fortunes of an industry. So when you may have a period of high growth, very buoyant growth, and yet the journalism may be terrible, or in large parts of it. So that distinction, they're related, but that distinction I think is always useful to keep in mind, that there is a distinction between the state of the news media and the state of journalism in a country, and it particularly applies to India. Then the changes came. I saw it change from, we used to lead type to photo composition, use of computers, and so on. That's the technology change, use of facsimile modes of transmission. At one point, we even flew aircraft to deliver copies to particular places, and so on. The whole game has changed, and the biggest change, of course, is what's happened in the impact of the digital age. And the media are struggling. All sections of them have taken a hit. There's this new phenomenon of pure play digital news players. Now you have this wonderful experiment, more than an experiment now, started by Pratik, fact checking. In fact, so far as AltNews is concerned, which I follow closely, it's more than just fact checking. They do quite deep investigations on selected issues, but I'll come to that a little later. So I think that change is big. We are under pressure. The constitutional and legal framework for protecting freedom of the press, which is really part in India. I won't go into the details of freedom of speech and expression, but the Supreme Court has read into it Article 19(1)(a) to be specific, freedom of the press, giving it something like a special place. TV doesn't necessarily enjoy it, but that's another debate. But overall, we used to be quite content with this framework for a long time. Then came the emergency, which was censorship and all, a dark period. But after the emergency, which was fairly short-lived, I think there was a buoyant period when I thought, looking back on it, journalism and particularly investigative journalism did pretty well. And it was a period of high growth also for the news media, and we were euphoric about our role in agenda building. Some people even claimed it was agenda setting, and so on. So finally, I came to an understanding the role of journalism in serious news media would be along the following lines. One, what are the functions or roles? The credible information function, one. Without credibility, you're nowhere, you get nowhere. But that's not enough. The second is a sort of critical function. It is investigative. It can be adversarial. We claim we are watchdogs, but there is something quite deep. It goes, deeper than the credible information function. And then you come to the educational function. To the extent journalism is often the pursuit of superficiality and dilettantism, but you can be an exception. And then if you do these positive functions well, you come to something called an agenda. I wouldn't say agenda setting, but agenda building role in partnership with other actors, other players, and so on. But of course, you can't forget, lest we have too romantic a view of journalism. You come back to the propaganda role, what Chomsky and Herman call the manufacture of consent, which is, I think, working big time in India. And I'll come to the present and stop. We are at a stage where, on the one hand, the industry is under pressure, of course, during the pandemic and the lockdown, but even before that, huge pressure. Revenues have declined, ads are very hard to get, circulation, distribution has become difficult for the printed product. And then on the other hand, the media are, the so-called mainstream media or the established media are serving to a large extent. We don't know the extent of it yet because we don't have the full picture. A propaganda arm of the BJP government, the Modi government. There's no doubt about it if you see that. But there have been changes from time to time. And the current period, when the whole world is looking at the mess that this government has made of its response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the shortages of oxygen, the shortage of hospital beds, the triumphalism that preceded it, saying we have defeated it. A resolution was passed by his party that they've virtually, in effect, slayed COVID-19. And then the shortage of vaccines, the so-called, we're supposed to be the world's vaccine factory. And you see the huge shortages that are around. So now I see, in response to this, I see a lot more criticism in main sections of the media, on television and in the press. And we must give credit to reporters who go before crematoriums and count the number of deaths, number of bodies that are being brought there to be cremated, compared with official figures, and it's clear that there's a huge underestimation. We don't know what the magnitude is, but in places like Uttar Pradesh, everywhere, in fact, there's significant to massive undercounting, underreporting of COVID-related deaths, COVID-19 related deaths. So that's where we are today, and there's some hope. I think the very large sections of the media are doing a very good job, but there we are. One other thing, and it's important, we have this, you had these new IT rules called which I hope Pratik or others will discuss, the Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code Rules 2021. And it claims to set up a system of self-regulation, but self-regulation goes right up, and an interministerial committee then judges the the decisions made by the self-regulation mechanisms in a three-tier system. And this is bizarre. These rules, they have been challenged before the Supreme Court or before the high courts, some high courts, and I think they'll end up in the Supreme Court. But yeah, there we are. We do face this challenge, but right now the media are quite active and involved largely, to a significant extent, in truth-telling, combined with elements of propaganda. So that's where we are. I have something to say later on if there's an opportunity on disinformation and hate speech, but I'll stop here, if I may. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Anram. I will also come back to you on the role of the media in propaganda, because it has historically also been not entirely clear where the media is standing, especially during the Cold War period, and the propaganda by the Russian television and the Reagan era propaganda, which was also in some ways spearheaded by the media itself. But coming to you, Pratik, if you can give us a sense of the fake news world that you have been dealing with in India, and how the propaganda itself feeds into the fake news narrative in India.
Thank you for having me here. So right now we are in India, we're in the middle of a massive sort of fake news wave, I would say. What happened was that elections just got over in a state called West Bengal, and West Bengal is known for post-poll violence. Now, what has happened so the post-poll violence happened as it happens after even small elections in West Bengal. And along with that came a huge amount of propaganda, which criminalized what was political violence, was given a sectarian angle. It was given a Hindu-Muslim angle. And along with that came a massive amount of images and videos which were claiming that these are the people who are being killed or injured, or these are the kind of scenes that you see in West Bengal. And a narrative was built. The actual casualty in the present West Bengal post-poll violence is, I think, somewhere between 15 and 20. I'm not sure what the exact official figure is. But with that sort of a figure, a narrative was built that a genocide is happening in Bengal, and it's a genocide of Hindus that is happening in Bengal. Now, to take the emotion from, to elevate the emotion from people processing the death of 14 people to people thinking that the death of 14 people is equivalent to a large-scale genocide, to elevate the emotion to that level, you need a lot of misinformation to make up for that gap of, the gap of narrative. And that is what we're seeing on social media in the past 3-4 days. And I think AltNews has done more than close to 15, 20 stories in the past 72 hours or so, where we have documented how, in a very organized manner, misinformation has been put out to create that narrative. So because the question was about how narratives are built, there can be no better example than what we have seen on the Indian social media in last 3-4 days, where despite people literally dying, gasping and for oxygen and dying in dozens across hospitals all over India, at least a certain section of the political landscape in India, all they could talk about is how, about this post-poll violence in West Bengal, because emotions were elevated to a level that the issue became more important than the fact that just yesterday about 25 people died in a hospital because of lack of oxygen. So that is the role misinformation plays, that it can completely displace real issues that people are facing and bring up artificial issues that takes attention away from the failures of the government. It can be any government. It could be a state government. It could be the government in the center. And the same phenomenon has been seen world over, including in the US elections, where you constantly use misinformation to take away the attention of citizens at large from the most concrete issues that they should actually be focusing on. And this happens again and again. Before every election, there's a spate of misinformation. In India and across the world as well, every time there is an issue which actually captures the attention of the nation, I'm talking more specifically about India right now, then we see a huge spurt in misinformation, because the primary motive of misinformation is to control the narrative. How do you steer the narrative to a more favorable narrative for the ruling government? That is what misinformation is doing. And the other thing that I would want to state is that this is done in a very organized manner. Very often, when we talk about misinformation, people say that it's a blooper. There are terms like that are used when you talk about misinformation. But in my experience of the last 4 years, what I have seen is the level at which we have to deal with misinformation. It is not coincidental, it is organized. And there are multiple examples which show that. For example, just before 2019 elections, the union elections in India, there was an airstrike in Pakistan by Indian Army in a place called Balakot, and this was after there was an attack on the Indian Army in a place called Pulwama, where multiple Indian soldiers died. Now, when this Balakot attack happened, a figure was put out claiming that 300 people had died in this particular attack. But all the international media organizations that actually visited this place, they claim that they could not find any evidence of such casualty, and it is probable that the Indian Air Force actually missed the target. Now, whatever the case be, but the fact was that there was no visual evidence to back this claim of the casualty of 300. But social media was flooded with pictures from Pakistan which showed mass casualties. And when we looked up these pictures were actually from people killed in a heat wave and an earthquake in Pakistan, which proceeded by 3-4 years. But the characteristic of these pictures was that there were multiple bodies in a single room. The attempt here was to show that people have died en masse, and the imagery that was chosen to show that, the misleading imagery that was chosen to show that, was that so many number of people in a single room. So what I'm trying to say here is that people who produce disinformation, they do so in a very organized manner as part of a design. There's a lot of thought that goes behind it as to what sort of image that needs to be used to propagate disinformation in a certain scenario. You use for example, right now when riots are happening, the kind of imagery that is going on around the West Bengal post-poll violence will be very different than what we saw during Balakot. So there's a lot of thought that goes goes behind what sort of imagery do we want to propagate some kind of disinformation. And at least in the Indian context, in the US context, it is different. In the US context, there are multiple websites like Breitbart and a lot of right-leaning websites which are sort of propagators of misinformation. But in the Indian context, what we see is most of the misinformation originates from social media. It's widely circulated on WhatsApp. I think WhatsApp in India has anywhere between 400 million and 500 million users now. That is more than populations of most countries. And one message can reach from north to south of India within minutes. And that is the power that this platform gives to people in the political circles as to how, and in terms of political messaging. Back in the days when we did not have WhatsApp and Facebook, people had to actually, political workers had to actually go from door to door to do political canvassing. They continue to do that, but now political canvassing can happen every single day, where you don't actually need workers to go from house to house to do that canvassing. And the way that is done is by a continuous barrage of propaganda. Some of it may be truthful, but it is very often mixed with a lot of fiction. And so that is what India is facing currently. That is, every single day, citizens of India are facing a huge amount of propaganda from a lot of political parties, but especially BJP-led propaganda. Now, what that does is that once this propaganda goes on social media, a lot of journalism is around what is happening on social media, So this video, just about, again, I'll go back to the recent example where on social media, it was claimed that in a certain place in West Bengal, a place called Birbhum, there were multiple gang rapes that had happened. And then the police eventually came out and denied this. But before that denial could come, multiple mainstream media organizations had already put out that information, mostly trying to say that it is factual, even though they're saying that this is an allegation, but without any investigation around the issue to actually determine whether, what are the facts of the matter. So once this huge amount of misinformation ends up on social media, mainstream media in India very often end up propagating it further. A very common example is, anytime there's a rally where there's predominantly Muslims, there'll be a video that will come out which will claim that Muslims in this rally have chanted slogans of Pakistan Zindabad. And most of the stories that we have looked at, which again, once it comes on social media, it is propagated by mainstream media. We just put out a story yesterday when something like that happened. And when we look at it, I would say 99% of the cases are false cases where, some other slogan is misinterpreted as Pakistan Zindabad. So what I'm trying to say here is that social media, while Mr. Enram pointed out that, mainstream media till the longest time would control what agenda, what are the agenda of the conversations. Now, social media plays a huge part in controlling that agenda because they actually end up dictating the agenda for mainstream media. So the narrative building starts from senior politicians putting out misinformation along with their entire cadre, mainstream media following that narrative, and then the entire population actually talking about something which does not have roots in reality. And this has been seen again and again in India.
Thanks a lot, Pratik, for that intervention, and also bringing it so poignantly that the political propaganda building is, it's not the same as the just fake news by the karyakartas or the local politician, but it's rather a very systematic affair happening to change the political landscape. So with this, Alaphia, I would like to bring you in to give us a little bit of global perspective, as well as to also make an intervention regarding what should the policies to counter disinformation and fake news may look like or should look like. Alaphia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And Mr. Ram, I can assure you I was part of the 10% that read the editorials of The Hindu growing up. And good to see you again. I want to start by saying, firstly, that social media's business model is fundamentally problematic and fundamentally at odds with the interests, with the public interest, and with the interests of democracy. And the social media business model is putting democracies everywhere at risk. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing I want to get into is also definitionally the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So the way the UN describes misinformation is when something is false, but there is no intention to deceive. Whereas, I'm always very deliberate about using disinformation, particularly in the Indian context, where there is a design to deceive, where it is meant to deceive. So definitionally, I just want to make sure that I stick to the words disinformation, particularly in the Indian context. Now, I can tell you a bit about what is underway in the EU, but before I do that, one of the ways in which the business model is fundamentally problematic and not in the interest of democracy is something that Pratik has already alluded to, which is that social media allows views at the extremes of society to rapidly become mainstream. And the way that happens is not just a function of a whole number of people wanting that to happen and doing that by design, but the product itself and the use of data enables that to happen quickly. So what do I mean by that? To give you an example, the way the recommender system, the algorithm of, let's say, a Facebook is designed, is to quickly read the signals of what is becoming viral, what is popular, how many people are liking something, how many people are commenting on something. And this unaccountable algorithm, which is like an unaccountable editor, this unaccountable algorithm then picks up those signals that, yes, this piece of content is going viral, so I'm going to promote it further. And essentially what, let's say, the BJP or the propaganda factories of the world have quickly figured out is that the more emotionally triggering your content, the faster it will go viral. It's just a really simple insight into the way social media works. And that works very nicely for anyone trying to propagate disinformation, because disinformation works really well when there are two things at play. One is when it's a combination of truth and lies. That is the most compelling kind of disinformation. When something is straight up fake, people question that. But when there's a sprinkling of truth and there's a combination of lies, that makes it really powerful. And the second thing that makes it really powerful is when the disinformation speaks to wedge issues within society already. So in the United States, it could be race relations. In India, we know religion and gender, are big fault lines in society. So when your disinformation sits within those fault lines, it's emotionally triggering. It works really well with the way the unaccountable algorithm is already designed to promote that content. The approach that the EU is trying to take, actually, before I get into the EU, I think we're at a critical moment globally over the next, let's say, up to 2024, when you have the EU, with functioning regulators, a functioning democracy, attempting to regulate big tech. And the way it is attempting to do so is to enforce product and policy changes. So not to take a content approach, but a systemic approach. What that means is social media platforms under the proposed Digital Services Act of the EU, social media platforms will be required to undertake a risk assessment of how do your recommender systems work. Do your systems actually violate fundamental rights? We're obsessed with free speech, but no one's paying that much attention to censorship by noise. So many people are being pushed off the platform, forced to keep quiet, because today there is censorship by noise. You put your head above the parapet and the troll armies come for you. Is there discrimination in job adverts? So for example, so many studies have shown that certain types of ads ads are shown just to women. So certain types of ads are shown just to men. There are discriminatory practices in the way the recommender system works, in the way the ad algorithms work. So what the EU is attempting to do in the next 18 months is to regulate these platforms that will enforce product and policy changes. One's hope is that when a major market like the EU with 300 million users requires these product and policy changes, that then has a knock-on effect and forces big tech to change its policies everywhere. If they can be incentivized to do so, then I think we've made a systemic attempt at tackling the problem of disinformation. Now, obviously, there will always be a place for fact-checking, and there will always be a place for content moderation, but the EU's attempt so far right now with the Digital Services Act is to make that sort of systemic intervention, and that will hopefully, if it survives big tech lobbying, come to life in the next 3 years.
Thanks a lot, Alaphia. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but first I would like to give it to Anu because I see his hand raised for quite some time. So Anu, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I'm Anubhav, I'm based in Paris, and I have my first question to Imran. But before I start my question, I just want to confirm and tell you that when I was a student in India, in my college in Maharashtra, I used to read the Hindu newspaper, which used to come one day late, which means I read for 4 or 5 years stale news from this newspaper, but I didn't complain. And I confirmed that the amount of work went into the editorials, the opinion pieces, the international news was all worth, and it has helped me shape my outlook. I ask you the first question, although you might have already partly answered it in your opening lines, but you can choose to skip or add. So how difficult it has been to do mainstream print media journalism in India since 2014. Also, second question is, I grew up hearing that the cities like Pune, Bangalore, people used to say that the city was better some 10, 20 years before, and but now when I look at all these years, I in fact feel that these cities, the old times were better, and it could be said that to all the society and the country as such. So how do you look at all these different decades that you have seen India has progressed? For Pratik, I have 2 quick questions as well. I remember that during the Delhi violence coverage, you had sent a tweet, and when you had said that this was very distressing, it was very disturbing, and for your team, it is very hard to look at into those gory videos, So my question is, how do you prepare your team and yourself psychologically, emotionally to go through this pain, and you save us in a way from that, And last thing is that I have been giving donations to AltNews, and since last few months, they are being returned, rebounds. I don't know if it's just for a glitch for me or it's a systemic problem. Thank you.
Yes, shall I go first? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I also want to say that it's very important to make this distinction Alaphia made between disinformation and misinformation. And that's now quite standard, including by WHO. It has a whole section on what it calls the infodemic curve during this pandemic. And there's a section on this. I won't elaborate on it, but mens rea or intention is the key to the difference. And also, I think disinformation scaled up is much more harmful than misinformation, which we do all the time in journalism, which is why corrections are required, which is why a public editor or, a reader's editor, as we call them in the Hindu or earlier in the Guardian, is important. Self-regulatory corrective mechanisms before you go, get into deeper trouble. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that AltNews does a great service by concentrating primarily on disinformation. Although it may also touch upon misinformation, but that's the real, because you got to prioritize. You can't look at everything and correct. So I think looking at AltNews, subject to what Pratik will say later, I think they take on, in the selection of harms, online harms, they take up primarily, or in the first place, disinformation, pay more attention to it, as they should. And they're doing a great job, I think. Speaking about this, I think if the other media report with context, the findings, the investigations and fact checking done by sites like or ventures like AltNews, I think this will be a better way of countering the social media, because the scale is quite different. Whether we can get at least cooperation among media organizations or journalists, groups of journalists who can then put it in the so-called mainstream media, and also, of course, the digital platforms, Wire, Scroll, Quint, Caravan magazine. They're doing a fantastic job in many respects. So I think if there's cooperation between this fact-checking and investigative service, public service, and the media organizations, that will go far. It's not your response to your question, but you asked me on how difficult it is since 2014, right? I think since we have not faced any great problems. I have not faced any kind of hardship. In a meeting, the Prime Minister once said that, he's my friend, but I'm sure, like, Ravan in the Hindu. So I said, you know what, Ravan represents in Sri Lanka. He's it's a different characterization there and so on. But that apart, we've not faced any great hardship, but others have, including freelance journalists, other media organizations, NDTV, and so on. But coming to print media, there are two challenges. One is existential. How do you pay? How do you break even, let alone make profits to support your journalism or whatever? It's still, print revenues account for the bulk of revenues. This is a fact for all major newspapers, whatever they claim. It's not the New York Times. There's no New York Times in India. So far as the large newspapers are concerned, the so-called major newspapers in various, any Indian language, it's still print that pays the bills largely, but digital revenues from a very low base are growing. But I don't see any new, viable, let alone profitable business model in sight to support the kind of journalism that was supported in earlier decades. When media organizations, their profits were high, there were surpluses, they could have post foreign correspondents, they could incur expenses chasing a story. For example, reference was made to Bofors. We never thought about any expense. I can tell you honestly, we didn't pay the sources, but there were many expenses, traveling to Sweden, traveling to Switzerland. Sometimes just, you got nothing. I went to Germany to try to investigate the so-called HDW scandal, and we drew a blank. But nobody raised an eyebrow when this sort of thing happened, because there's no guarantee that an investigation will succeed. But today, they're counting pennies, they're counting paise in news organizations. Travel is restricted. I don't know how many reporters actually go out. The pandemic makes it, it's a haze. We don't know, but we do know that a lot of reporters go before crematoriums and count the number of bodies. And I read recently from a website that when I last saw it, it may have gone up. 139 journalists died of COVID or COVID-related causes during the pandemic, of whom 90 died in the last 35 or 40 days, and in the second wave, in other words. So they are doing their job, but we don't know in a normal situation, how many will go out and actually report from the field, whether the editors think that is necessary at all, and so on. These are the changes we encounter, but it is a challenge to do journalism here. The New York Times has increased the number of journalists, but it's a one-off. It's an exception. I don't think there are too many like that anywhere in the world, where digital revenues fuel their journalism and take it to another level, and so on. So how do you fund journalism today? That's a big question. This debate has been going on for the last 15, 20 years, more than 20 years. No clear answers yet. We are all living on hope. One metaphor was in a book called Out of Print, throwing spaghetti at the wall, some of it will stick, but there's not enough for you to feast on or feed on, let alone feast on. So these are things that are happening in journalism, but I hope that we'll be able to discuss this business of disinformation and hate speech later on, because I have something to say on it, because I'm part of an initiative, something led by the BBC called the Trusted News Initiative, which begin, but I won't elaborate unless there's an opportunity or interest.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Ram. Actually, there is some similar questions to what you were discussing, and I thought that perhaps you can also reflect on that. And I see Alina also raising her hand, and she had a similar question as well. So the first one, which is from an anonymous attendee, was that how the social media itself is leading to the decrease in influence of the newsroom on news, which I think, again, somewhere ties up with the business model itself. And then Alina, please go ahead with your question as well.
But we haven't heard Pratik. Some question was asked to him, wasn't he?
Yes, but we will come to Pratik in a bit. Sorry, Pratik, but just to carry on the conversations.
Yeah, thank you very much. I constantly bring this up because I find it still shocking. A couple of months ago, this place called EU Disinfo Lab, they brought up a report saying that several fake news outlets, not just news outlets publishing fake news, but completely fake, names adopted, changed, dead people revived and transformed into ostensibly alive journalists, that they had been publishing either misleading information or completely fake information that then was taken in auto-generated feeds and spread across the actual real news network. So content created by journalists who do not actually exist as such, then through just automation was put onto actual legitimate platforms. And then I suppose AltNews had to go at it and say, no, this actually didn't happen, or that's not true, which creates a lot of effort. So my question is on this auto generation of content. If just some place that is legitimate publishes something and then all of the other newspapers cover it, to what extent is this desirable versus dangerous?
I think it is harmful. How harmful depends on how dangerous the news is. For example, on COVID-19, there's so much disinformation on that, including things like 5G networks, and there's even on some of the drugs, hydroxychloroquine, which is being pushed and so on. But these are arguable and on science. But I think there are ways to counter this by professional journalism, and we have lots of guidance on it. In fact, I have a note on that, what we presented to the Trusted News Initiative, what we do in the Hindu about sourcing videos, sourcing information from television, from Twitter, how to check, how to verify. So if you do, rules in place for sourcing photographs and videos and so on. And, there are many ways of doing that. And then you have engineering solutions, what are called engineering solutions, AI, using AI to spot this. That's another area. Pratik may be able to say more about that. But there are media organizations in the UK, in Canada, in the US, which are developing these. Not yet in place fully, but they are there. But if you go to what I referred to earlier, the WHO's guidance on let's flatten the infodemic curve, they actually give very practical advice so far as COVID is concerned, COVID-19, how to counter this. And I think the short answer to your question, I think, is every media organization, every professional journalist has to do this, Assess the source, one, go beyond the headline. I'm just reading the label. Go beyond the headlines from WHO note. Identify the author. Check if such an author exists, real or not. Check the date. AltNews has turned up many things which are completely outdated. Of course, the geography may be different, but also the date. Old things being linked to the current. So check the date. Examine the supportive evidence. Check your biases, because biases make a huge difference in this. Turn to fact checkers, turn to AltNews, and so on. So I think there's no excuse for professional media to relay, to relay this stuff that they get. We get all kinds of, queries from people. Oh, you missed this news, and so on. And 90% of the time, it turns out that it's false. It's disinformation or misinformation, whichever it is. So I think there are good old ways of checking this. You can say, you can't. The problem is, I can do it to my content, whether it's in print or online. But how do I take on the job of tackling all that out there in the social media? The scale is huge. There I have to resort to the role of advocacy. The UK, for example, I've been studying this. Earlier for print, you had the Leveson inquiry report and recommendations, which I think were very valuable, but were not accepted by the major newspapers. But right now, I've been looking at the UK approach to what they call online safety. There was a white paper on online harms launched in April of 2019. It led to a government response. They compared it also with the European Commission's Digital Services Act package, came out in December 2020. But I've been looking at the latest document put out by the UK government, its final response to the consultation, and looks interesting. The regulator will be Ofcom. There'll be, there's a duty of care which was established. They elaborate on it. There'll be secondary legislation to elaborate on it. But Ofcom has a good track record. The problem is, in a country like India, this will play into the hands of the government. If you set up there's no regulator like Ofcom, which has a pretty good track record in regulating both television and radio programs and also video streaming. Nobody has any real quarrel with it, as far as I know, Ofcom. And they are now, the government, the UK government has signaled that it's going to entrust this important role of looking at online harms of regulating online harms to Ofcom with various, and somebody, I think Alaphia mentioned processes and systems. That's what they're going to lay down. But in India, where you may have on paper, a good set of codes of practice or even a regulatory mechanism on paper, but it will be used in a very prejudicial way. It'll be, the rule of law will not be enforced, equitably, as we have seen repeatedly. We saw the violence in Northeast Delhi in February of 2020, the so-called riots. It was a targeted attack on Muslims living there, and there's been some very good reporting on this, and so on. So that's our problem. A good system working in a different context where there's some democratic accountability, will play into the hands of the far right, an authoritarian government, a government which believes in dividing the people on religious lines, which encourages hate speech big time. There's no doubt about it. The Law Commission, there's a Law Commission report on what to do about hate speech. The National Law Commission in India came out in 2017, led nowhere. There are enough laws. There's no hate speech law, but there are enough laws around hate speech to, if a political regime or authority wanted to really get rid of hate speech in an objective or even-handed way, there's no problem. There are more than enough laws, but they will not do it. So how do you guard against the guardians? How do you protect online users against the guardians, and so on? These are issues that are before us. Does that come anywhere near responding to your question? I don't know.
Yes, indeed, it does. And while talking of the institution, and I know Alaphia will have a follow-up question on that as well. I think she's raised her hand. But I want to go to Pratik first with Anuban's question on the human cost of it all, because in the entire institutional and democratic discourse, we are not actually taking into account the psychological and the human cost or the mental health cost that the news fact checkers are subjecting themselves to. So Pratik, to you.
Right, so that's a very important question. And for example, the last few days, again, because we've been dealing with riots, all we have been looking at the past 72 hours is dead bodies, bloodied bodies, injured bodies. And that is the only kind of content that we've been consuming in the past 72 hours. So it does have an impact. Unfortunately, so the AltNews science editor, Dr. Sinha, she's a neuroscientist, and she has put forward suggestion that we should come up with a framework wherein all members of the team go through at least biannual consultations and to see what the status of their mental health is. Unfortunately, that policy is not yet in place. But numerous pieces have been done. For example, I think Vice did a long form piece on how Facebook moderators go through the worst when they have to look at the side of content that they do and how they're underpaid and things like that. I think recently there was a piece by another news organization, I forget which, also looked at the issues that Facebook moderators face. And we also sort of look at, I think we do face some of the issues. It is just that that is not the only thing we do. There are other creative aspects to the profession than just looking at content and moderating. We also come out with stories, we do investigations. So there's a creative aspect to it, which probably makes the impact less than what probably Facebook moderators go through. But it is definitely something that needs to be spoken about more as to, the kind of content that fact checkers have to deal with, or the moderators have to deal with day in and day out, because we are always looking at the dark side of the world. So that is one thing. I briefly wanted to comment on the issue of policy, etc., that Alaphia was mentioning too. The problem in India is, and one issue that is probably glossed over is that, yes, the business model of Facebook is the biggest issue. But the other thing that Facebook does, especially in countries like India, Cambodia, Bangladesh, that they are very close to the government. Everybody keeps forgetting that they are very close to the government. And so one of the top Facebook employees in India used to run a website which was essentially to promote Mr. Modi as the Prime Minister candidate in 2013, before he was first elected as the Prime Minister. And he is in one of the top 2-3 employees in India of Facebook. So any kind of policy decision is not something that I see on the horizon, at least in countries like India, etc., concerned, where because of the closeness of the ruling government and the social media organizations and the way business happens in India, you have to be friends with the government to run such large enterprises such as Facebook, Google, and Twitter. So, I'm very doubtful whether any policy intervention will happen. I'm more hopeful of educational interventions in educational frameworks and policies than any other kind of content-related interventions. Yeah, that's about it.
Thanks a lot, Pratik, for that. If I can bring back Alaphia, Pratik, and Ram, all three of you on this, that what kind of institutional interventions can actually take shape, and knowing it well that we are not in a place where we can, as Pratik said, that we can have an intervention in India because the government will not be willing to cut out its own propaganda, of course. And if it will be willing, it will hurt the minorities across. We know that very well, and we know that it'll hurt the free speech. So what kind of interventions can we look towards? Because I remember like one of the previous panels that we had, and we were talking about the migrants, right? And we talked also a little bit on the disinformation regarding migrants. And then we brought in the Global Compact on Migration, which actually effectively states in Agenda 24 that cut out the noise which criminalize migrations. So it puts a governmental responsibility in that sense. So is there some similar kind of interventions that we can look towards or go towards? Please, any of you who would.
I wanted to jump in here to, like, firstly, I fully agree with what Pratik said, that the problem in many countries, such as India, is that the leadership of the Facebook is pretty much indistinguishable as an extension of the IT wing of the ruling government. And so there are real problems in how these organizations are staffed. I wanted to say a couple of things. One is, I've been speaking to former employees of Facebook and WhatsApp. What they tell me is, firstly, the thing that resonates within these companies, the thing that makes them, forces them to look at a problem, is when there is elite media coverage. By elite media, I mean the New York Times and the Washington Post, the North American media that is the echo chamber of the Facebook, of people in Silicon Valley. So one is, if you can get your evidence, if you can get coverage in North American media, it forces them to look at these issues and exposes their serious double standards. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that has been somewhat underexplored is also corporate pressure on brands that fund websites like Op India and others, the fake news factory. This is all ultimately funded also by advertising. Which are the brands, and are there international brands? Can we pressure those brands to pull their ads? Now, all of this obviously requires a lot of research, but that is one of the other viable avenues of pressure. And then the last thing I want to say, and this is really like a call to action, is that Facebook, they hired a head of human rights, I believe in 2017. When Miranda Sissons, the head of human rights, came on board, they commissioned a human rights impact assessment in India. What is their product? How is it impacting human rights in India? That report should have been ready in April 2021. I've heard nothing of where it's at. I think we as civil society need to be pressuring Facebook to make that full impact assessment public. It will be embarrassing to them, but unless the human rights team gets pressure to do that, the incentive is inside Facebook is to bury that report. And so I think, as civil society, we absolutely need to be pressuring Facebook to make that human rights impact assessment public. And the full report, not just the executive summary.
Yeah, that's actually the hope from our end as well. And for those who might not be aware, that we were also giving some assessments, and from our own foundation, we did supply some materials for that human rights assessment report on India. And we are hoping that at least a first draft of it will be there in 2 weeks time, but we don't know how, given how the Facebook has been working out. So coming back again to Ram, and I know you also brought in the ethical code, which has been passed recently on social media and the media using the web platforms. how does it applies to Pratik? This is a question for you as well. The media code that the government wants you to use. How do you see it from the Indian in an Indian landscape where the media, where the government is in some ways have always and consistently have tried in the past as well. Throughout, we have seen throughout our legislation, litigations in Indian code, that there has been a massive amount of litigations in Indian code for Article 19, mostly coming through the press. So how do you see it, and what is the institutional way forward there?
The impact of the new media rules, the IT 2021 rules, has not really been felt yet. It's still it's there. It's in place, but the impact is not yet felt yet. We don't know which way it will go because it's being challenged in some high courts on grounds that it is unconstitutional also, apart from being illegal. The big media, I think the media organizations, the industry is somewhat divided on it, and they did not speak with one voice on this. Certainly, some of the major players banded together and, according to some reports, lobbied the government to, because I think they, yeah, whatever. But this has to be fought. There's a wrong impression that this will affect only the the startups, the pure digital players like Wire, Scroll, etc. But that's not the case. If you read the rules, these rules, they would apply equally to the digital offerings of the so-called mainstream media, both print, I mean, newspapers, television, everything. Apart from video, these companies, the so-called technology companies. That's one. So there are articles on it. I'll be happy to send it. One by Sashi Kumar. The new media rules are a tightening noose. What is worrying is the executive's idea that users need to be protected against the very media that seek to inform them. That's one. That's an article. And there's also the Internet Freedom Foundation has put out some very good briefs on this and what to do about it, including litigation. But you asked about also institutional ways, and drawing from our experience from the Trusted News Initiative, they've developed, a framework has been developed where many media organizations cooperate, and if somebody detects disinformation which would cause harms, these are not round the year but related to elections. What Facebook did in the U.S. president, the previous U.S. presidential elections, in the last UK elections, and so on. Evolution of or setting up a cooperative framework in real time, where it involves also newsroom agreements to tip others off in real time when they detect disinformation. Of course, you can also look at the fact-checking websites, but they are doing it systematically, and it appears that it has been quite useful, but only in relation to these episodes. It's not around the year. It's also on, they're going to try it out for COVID-19. The other one is engineering solutions, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has developed something called Project Origin, building an engineering solution for imposter and altered content. And these things, I think, are going to be shared freely or widely. The other very important thing, I'll pick up from what, a passing reference made by Pratik to education. I think it's extremely important, and in this discussion, the Trusted News Initiative, in fact, where Facebook, Google, Nick Clegg is part of this summit. I've been in those discussions where he's been a participant. He's paid by, he's an employee. And all the technology companies are represented in this initiative, and along with the Financial Times, the BBC, the Hindu in India, several others, so on. So the idea is to get the technology companies to pay a tax for what they are doing. You know, they don't put it in those ways, to fund large scale media literacy or media education programs, which then can be put into the high school system or whatever level, and higher education as well. I think journalism schools can be brought into this. I'm involved in the Asian College of Journalism as one of the founding trustees, and I think you can do a lot by educating young journalists on this, on disinformation, on hate speech, and how to, you know, there's a very, very thin line between protecting free speech and restricting hate speech. You know, it's very, very different. Depends on the legal jurisdictions, and you could go, you know, too far one way. Everyone knows this, but I think you can do a good job with media education, research on disinformation and misinformation. We've been doing some of that in the Asian College of Journalism. But if you have a network of good journalism schools across countries, I think there can be some progress in this business of taking on this hugely scaled up, weaponized disinformation, which causes harm. I think you should also look at, you know, some is completely silly. We don't take on all misinformation or even disinformation, but you got to prioritize and what causes harm, which is why the UK white paper was called Online Harms. So the impact is as important as anything else. So I think in finding ways, we should do that, and where people's networks are available, like the summit, what the summit is seeking to do, I think this should be high on the agenda, particularly during for example, during the pandemic, the kind of harm that is being done by disinformation, and also to some extent misinformation. I think it's enormous, and WHO, I think, has been quite good. Has done a good job in at least warning people about it, putting it down in an accessible way, telling them in practical ways, how do you combat this? How do you avoid it? How do you prevent it? This infodemic, a term that they have invented, not a very elegant term, but I think it's quite useful at the present. So I think there are institutional ways and means, but above all, making these so-called technology companies, reining them in, bringing them under the rule of law, bringing them into a democratic, under democratic control, make them accountable, not the way they're doing it in India, where the secretary of the INB secretary can just order, you know, can block, but through a simple executive order can block content or online content without resorting to the new rules which I referred to. This power is already there, but I think we can, it's hard work.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Enram. And in fact, this also reminded me that, like, at least in Netherlands, they have now come very strongly towards instituting the media literacy programs in the high schools, actually, and also forming it as part of the civic education within the school curriculums. And this also reminds me that in our EU-India summit, there is one of the components that the countries are going to discuss in the multilateral relationship is actually education and the transfer of knowledge, mostly on the technical grounds, but there is perhaps a way that we can put this intervention and say that there should be more exchanges also on media literacy, especially given that we do not expect much coming out from India itself on the scope of regulating fake news and false narratives and disinformation. Anyone from Alaphia and Pratik, if you may want to have a final intervention in this and perhaps suggest something which would be relevant for the European-Indian relationship going forward. or which you would like to bring on board for that? Thank you.
I mean, I'd reiterate what I said earlier, which is that the EU should see what it's doing through the Digital Services Act as potentially having global ramifications that can really rein in the risks of the business model of big tech. We will not solve the problem of disinformation, but we will at least try to cramp the business model and ensure that right now the playing field between good information, let's just call it good information, journalism, fact checking, the gathering and collection of information that requires effort, time, all of that, the field is completely rigged in favor of bad information. And through the Digital Services Act, through enforcing product changes, we can try and rebalance. This will not be and cannot be the only intervention. And Mr. Ram alluded to, the sort of news media bargaining code that Australia has set a precedent with. We need to level the playing field in other ways as well. And fact checking and content moderation can be the last line of defense. But by enforcing product changes on the platforms via a big market like the EU, we can potentially start to rein in the very rogue business model.
Alaphia, for that, Pratik.
So, when we talk about disinformation, misinformation, there's a variety of disinformation. There's in India, in the last 1 year, we have seen medical misinformation. We've seen lots of political disinformation, and it has varying impacts. I think the need of the hour is to look at it in not as a holistic subject, but as individual issues. So, for example, when somebody states on Twitter that if you sniff at camphor, it is going to protect you from COVID, that needs probably a different intervention than when an image of a dead man is put out claiming that a Muslim person killed a Hindu, while there may not be any truth to it. So I think different issues need different interventions. I know that last year when the child kidnapping rumors happened, multiple police organizations and the administration, they did large-scale awareness programs to try and rein in the issue. And they did see some amount of success. In Kerala, when there was an issue around misinformation on vaccination in a town called Kannur, there was large-scale awareness program that was taken out by the collector there, and that saw a lot of success. So certain kind of disinformation, misinformation, which does not have bearings in the political discussion, which is not, the problem with countries like India is that we are extremely polarized. So when it comes to political issues, it is difficult to address those issues purely through education. But at least we need to start addressing the non-political misinformation, which is equally harmful. Firstly, we need to start addressing that more and more through education, and that is where cross-continental intervention can be important to recognize that this intervention is needed, and whatever funds that need to be pumped in, or syllabus that needs to be created. Recently, I was from 8th grade girls, class teacher for 8th grade girls, she reached out to us, and she told us that she had given an essay writing exercise to her students, stating that the essay was about COVID and its implications and its solutions. And she anonymously, without the names, she sent us the copies of the essays. And what we found was that the essays were riddled with what is shared on WhatsApp, including claiming that if you stop your breath for a minute, it is a COVID test. This was put out by one Mr. Baba Ramdev in a TV show, and that has made it to the essay of a 8th standard student. So interventions there have to be different. interventions in the political ecosystem, where we try and force Facebook, etc., to moderate better. Alaphia mentioned that it's only when the North American media takes up issues do they actually react, and that is so true, because we end up writing emails after emails to Facebook and Twitter, and all they send us back is a link to the policy document. There are, a quick example would be Twitter has a policy where that once an account is taken down, they cannot come back. And Indian social media ecosystem is riddled with accounts where they have been suspended, and yet they are online again. And they were suspended firstly for the reason because of the online harm that they were propagating. But there's absolutely no control over that. And the same accounts come back and gain thousands and thousands of followers in no time. So, the other pressure mechanism obviously has to be international media recognizing this issue of complete policy paralysis in terms of social media companies in India, where they are not, where they do not follow any of the set policies, and that also needs to be highlighted more. So yeah, there are multiple interventions. All I want to say is that let's look at the issue not as a holistic issue, but break it down into smaller issues and look at individual solutions, look at different tech solutions, look at how to disperse fact checks more widely. There are multiple things that can be possible. And yeah, obviously it needs a longer discussion.
Thanks a lot, Pratik. And it is in fact very true what you said, that we do need to have multiple interventions at multiple places. And in our attempt, our very little attempts that we are trying to do here, we will continue to collaborate with you as well on how to take these interventions forward and perhaps make a bit of a change or a ripple of a change in the ocean of disinformation in the coming years. So with this, I would like to thank all of you, because I'm being mindful of the time that we are already 15 minutes ahead of our schedule. And I would like to continue having these discussions with you and invite you again for such sessions, perhaps more informally at times, to really think through the solutions and also to think through what the roadmap for the EU-India intervention on the digital landscape should look like, or rather the relations, not the interventions, should look like. And I would thank all the team as well for being here and for putting up the questions. I hope we have dealt with most of the questions for today, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Ritumbra. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Bye.